Today we're going to learn how to load in JSON data or JSON data, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And it's where we take JavaScript objects and store them as files, and then we can load them in from an external source. That external source can be a single file, so a file that's just saved with the extension .json, or it could be from an API GET request that requests the data and it comes back as a response. So first we're going to start with just learning how to load in JSON data from a file. Let's look at this document here. This document has 3 nodes, and every JSON file always opens with a bracket that opens and then a curly bracket for each node. Also note that there are commas at the end of the preceding nodes, and then you do not have a comma at the last one. You'll see the same thing for the key value pairs. So in JavaScript objects, we have the concept of a key and a value. And so the key value pair concept says this is what you're looking for and this is what the value is. That can be a string as it is here, or it can be a number. Whatever your different data objects that you have in JavaScript, it can all be stored in JSON. Now, one key important thing to make sure that you're doing with JSON is that you have well-formatted, well-formed JSON. And so I use JSON lint for doing this. And so the easiest way is to just Command A, copy, paste it in, and then hit validate JSON. And you should see a green thing here that says valid JSON. But let's say you had forgotten a comma. Oops, sorry, I hit save. Say you've forgotten a comma, you can hit validate JSON and it will highlight your error and define your error here for you. So you can go in and fix it and then validate. And then if you do change things here, make sure you copy them back over to your file so that you have them. Now, the thing about JSON and loading it in JavaScript, if it is not well formed, if it has problems, it will fail on load. And so the browser won't know how to handle a poorly formed JSON format. So you've got to make sure you fix it first. So that's the first thing I do. If someone's coming to me with a problem or something's not working right, the first thing you should do is always go validate your JSON. Okay. So once we have good, clean, validated JSON, I save that file to make sure we have it saved. And then let's go look at how we're going to pull this in. So I've given you some index files and JavaScript files, and let me just walk you through what we have. We have some basic styling that you're going to see in here. And I have an H1, and then we have a div for targeting where we're going to put our data. And we have a div where we could write a chart. So today what we want to cover is basically get to this point where we're going to write out all of our different pieces. We're going to extract the information out of the JSON and write it to the HTML. So the first thing let's do is let's talk about the object. So I mentioned key value pairs. In JavaScript, you can have a variable for an object. In this case, I called it instructor. It has a key and a value. And so name, age, and we have that here. So that can be called. And so if I console.log instructor, you'll see we have an object, so the curly bracket shows this and shows the value. So it's really easy to see and read and to access it. So I can use the object name and then I can do dot name, and then it will log for me the actual text string of there, or I could do my age and refresh, and then it's 39. It gives me the number. So that's an easy way of, you're using an object. Now that is not JSON because it's not saved as an external file, or it's not written in the object notation. It's just an object itself. So, what is the difference between a JavaScript object and JSON? Typically, when we're talking about JSON, we're talking about a file that exists separately or a full key value pair set is sent from another server. So typically we're talking about how it's transported, not just as an object in our file. but technically, it's a JavaScript object, so it's kind of hard to define which is which. Okay, so let's keep moving. In our document, in our project, we want to make sure that we are loading things with a document ready function so that everything is ready to go. And so I'm going to kick everything off with a document ready. And in this, I'm going to call another function just to keep everything nice and clean. So once document ready is, I'll have my kickoff functions. In this particular case, I'm going to do one called parse. No, sorry, we're going to do load data. So I need a load data function. Okay. And so load data is going to basically just load in our JSON file and store it for us. So the way we're going to do that is using the get JSON request. And this will be a curly bracket semicolon to close it out. All right, and so in my get JSON request, I am going to pass it the URL. So in this case, it's a local file. It's in the same directory, so the URL is a relative URL, easy to find there. And then what do I want to do? Like, how do I want to store it? What's the object going to be called once it's loaded so that it gets stored? So the object is going to be called classes, and I'm going to open the classes.json. So just so you can see what that does, let's go ahead and console log classes. So my data has 3 items, and when I logged it, I have 3 items, all of those different things. So what we know is this worked successfully. So we loaded the JSON and it worked. Let's show you what happens if the file is not available. You would get a 404 error. And so you know that that URL does not exist. Okay. The other thing that might happen is if you just didn't use the right object, you just call it, that it's just not defined. So what we want to do is just make sure this is going to be our new object for the name of our new object that we're going to be storing all of our data in. So to keep things nice and clean and simple, let's go ahead and create and call a new function called parse data. And the reason I'm doing this is I want you to see how we can organize our code in a way that makes sense to keep it nice and organized and able to have specific functions for specific purposes, which will allow us to do different things as we move forward. So in this case, this function, we need to pass it the classes object, because that data would only be available inside this function because that's where it was defined first. And so we need to call that function and pass classes. So let's write a new function called parse data and receive classes. I also like to use plural forms when I'm using objects because typically objects have multiple nodes. Just like a lot of JSON would have multiple things. So if I'm saving multiple things in an array, I always use plural, and most of the time my objects are plural. And so I would say, this is all the classes. So just a note about how I choose to save that. So, all right, so we do classes. All right, so in our function parse data, we're going to do a couple of things. First thing we want to do is I want to make sure we understand how we're getting, how we deal with and load in our JSON. So we have the classes object, and we can address it the same way we were before. So I can go to classes 0, index 0 dot name. And so I get 487, so that shows me that I'm getting this name of the first object, right? But when we're working with multiple things like arrays and objects, we want to do this in a loop. So we're not going to want to put this in one at a time. We want to do this in a for loop. And so we'll use the shorthand JavaScript's or jQuery's for loop here because it's really easy to write here. So we just do, jQuery select run each for each one of these objects inside of class, or each node, I should say, inside of class. Go ahead and do this function and pass the index, which is the count, the I that's going through. So, so we run this for loop, and so let's just kind of do our same console log here, but instead of 0, we'll put index here. That's just like our I in a previous loop that we've done in this class. And then we'll log that. And so now we should see all of them coming in. So we have 487. The reason we have this twice is because I had it up here, so I can delete that now, or I'll comment it out for y'all so you'll have it. All right, so now we have the 3 times. Okay, so here we have the same kind of loop we were doing when we were dealing with XML, a for loop that finds all the nodes and does whatever we want to do with it. So in this function, we want to build some HTML to print this to the page. And so let's go ahead and just create a variable inside our function here called HTML, and we're going to make it an empty string. And then as we go through, let's go ahead and just get the name and make that our headline. So HTML concatenate or append to an H2, and then classes index, whichever time we are through the loop, get the name, just like I did above here, just kind of saving it as an HTML variable. And then let's go ahead and write that to the page. And so I need to, we're going to do append HTML this time. So outside of the loop, but inside my function, I am going to select the ID of data and append HTML. So let's save it, refresh it, and now we should see in our page all the different headlines for all 3 classes. All right. Now what I want you to do is think about what's the next step. So if I do HTML plus equals and I want to do the instructor, what would you put in here? So I'm going to go ahead and give you the first part, and I want you to think about what you would do in the next piece of this code. What should you put right here to get the instructor? If you look back at your code, you have the instructor is the key. And so we can use the same syntax. Instead of dot name, it'll be dot instructor. Plus, and then we need to close the loop. Not the loop, I'm sorry, close the li. So, and so now I have the instructor, but it's getting more and more nested, so we don't want the nesting, which is probably just I need to close the UL. There we go. So, so we have an li. Now, I want you to think about this and do this on your own. I want you to add the max number of students. So create a bullet point and put in max number of students, and it should say 14 in the first one. So go ahead and do that yourself. Stop the video, do that, and then we'll pick it back up. All right. So I'm going to take this a little bit farther and format it a little bit differently. So we're going to have another li of the number of student registered colon, and then pass in the object here and get number of students, and where I got that from was right from the JSON. So number of students. And then I'm going to make it where it says of and then get the max number of students. So I'm getting both of those. So let's take a look at that. So you see, same thing, just all we need to do is put in the key of the one we want. And let's go ahead and while we're at it, we'll get the rating. And obviously we could do some fancier HTML and CSS if we wanted. And instead of just displaying the text, we could display the number of stars or whatever based on the rating. But for now, all I want us to do is to extract the data out. So rating 4.7449. All right, so we have the data, we're loading it in, we're saving the HTML, and then we're writing it to the page. Okay, so running through the loop, creating and saving HTML. That's basically what we're doing right now. So that's a valuable piece and what we'll do a lot of times. But sometimes you may want that data kind of transformed into a different way. So if we were to want to build a chart, and so let's say we want to put a high charts piece here that's loaded in with JSON data, we probably should do that in its own function, because I like to keep mine all nice and clean. So right after we write the HTML, let's go ahead and call the next function, which would be build charts. Okay. So create this new function, build charts. Okay. And I'm going to basically just copy some example data that came from C3. So I'm just getting one of their examples of a bar chart, but I'm going to show you how to put JSON data instead of hard coding the data in here. I'm going to show you how to put JSON data in it. So inside this function, I'm going to paste this in, and then we'll walk through what it does. So remember, in a previous class, we learned how to do JSON data charts, or we learned how to do C3 charts. This is how we do it, where we populate it with JSON data. So you're going to need a parameter, which is an object here called data, and you pass it the key of JSON, and its value is a list of items. It's also a key value pair. And so we have basically max students as a label, and then the data of max students. Now, this is a little bit different. This is an array that I need to make, because if we look here, this is basically accepting a list of items, a list of numbers specifically. And so we can pass it a list of numbers, so but we basically need to make that array. So the easiest way to do that is back in our loop, we would want to, every time we probably want to push something to the array. So we're going to do number of students. And if we did the same thing, max number of students. So what I've done is I've created another array called these two things. And then I'm pushing to the array every time through the loop, index, and then whatever is extracted out of the data. So this is just a transformation of the data to get it in a format that'll be easy to pass to the chart. So one thing I need to do is to define these variables, and I want them available in multiple functions. So I'm going to go to the top here, and I'm going to do var number of students. And let's go ahead. Actually, let's just make it an empty array. And same thing, max number of students. Oops, excuse my typing. All right, now let's see if we did all of this right. So we have a chart. It's going to the chart ID, and we pass some data to it, and it's going to be a bar chart. So let's save it, refresh it, and we have a chart. So see, it says max students, enrolled students, and we basically have passed this number in here from an external data source. So if this was connected to an API, it would be updating constantly. Every time someone loads the page, it's going to get the latest data and do that. If you needed to update or change your JSON to change the charts, all you got to do is change the JSON file. So this is really the best way for us to be building these for dynamic web applications that are going to be changing over time. So JSON is a very powerful and helpful tool, and we're going to be using it a lot in this class, especially as we get farther along using APIs.